I want to begin this story in a time before gardening books had glossy covers, before chemicals came in plastic bottles, before words like optimized, patented, or formulated were ever associated with growing plants. Long before those ideas existed, gardeners already knew something we seem to have forgotten. They understood that plants helped other plants grow, and that the land itself carried memory, chemistry, and instruction. The earliest written records of this knowledge do not come from laboratories or universities. They come from monasteries, farming villages, and handwritten agricultural notes passed quietly between generations. In medieval Europe, monks documented how certain trees, when planted near young cuttings, caused them to root faster and survive longer. These observations were not framed as miracles. They were recorded as repeatable facts. The land behaved a certain way, and attentive people noticed. One tree appeared again and again in those records. It grew near water. It thrived where soil was disturbed. It was flexible, resilient, and almost impossible to kill. Willows were not admired for their beauty. They were valued because life followed them. Cuttings planted near willow groves survived drought better. Transplants failed less often. Branches pushed into damp soil rooted so reliably that the tree itself became a living demonstration of its own power. This knowledge was not considered secret. It was considered obvious. Farmers noticed that broken willow branches stuck in the ground would sprout roots within weeks. They noticed that plants grown near these trees recovered faster from damage. The conclusion was practical, not mystical. Something in the tree encouraged growth. Something moved from the wood into the soil, and from the soil into other plants. For centuries, this understanding lived comfortably inside everyday practice. There was no product to sell, no formula to protect, no market to dominate. Knowledge traveled the way it always had, through observation, repetition, and trust. If a method worked, it stayed. If it didn't, it disappeared. The willow method stayed. By the 1700s and 1800s, as formal horticulture began to take shape in Europe and North America, this plant-based knowledge was still present, though increasingly undocumented. Estate gardeners used branch infusions to improve propagation success. Nurseries quietly soaked cuttings in plant extracts without labeling the process. It was simply what you did if you wanted better results. No one felt the need to explain why it worked, because it worked consistently enough to need no defense. The shift began when gardening started to change from a practice into an industry. As universities formalized agricultural education, they favored methods that could be measured, isolated, and reproduced under controlled conditions. Folk knowledge, even when effective, did not translate easily into textbooks. It lacked diagrams, chemical names, and institutional backing. Slowly, methods that could not be easily standardized began to fade from official instruction. Still, the plants continued to behave the same way. Willows did not stop rooting easily. Cuttings planted near them did not suddenly fail. The natural method did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the framework around gardening changed. Knowledge that could not be packaged began to feel invisible. The true turning point came in the early 20th century when plant physiology entered the laboratory. Scientists began isolating compounds responsible for growth, rooting, and resistance. What had once been observed as a whole system was now broken into parts. This was not malicious. It was the natural direction of scientific curiosity, but it had consequences that few people noticed at the time. When researchers isolated indole-3-butyric acid, or IBA, they identified the chemical trigger that caused cuttings to form roots. This was a genuine scientific achievement. It explained what gardeners had been seeing for centuries. But instead of pointing people back to the plants that naturally produced it, the discovery moved in a different direction. The molecule was synthesized, patented, bottled. Once rooting became a product, the original source became inconvenient. Textbooks began teaching the molecule, not the tree. Extension programs recommended powders and solutions rather than branches and water. Over time, the older method was not argued against. It was simply no longer mentioned. Knowledge does not always disappear through opposition. Sometimes it disappears through silence. By the mid-20th century, entire generations of gardeners were trained without ever hearing about plant-based propagation aids. They learned that success required precise chemicals, controlled environments, and purchased inputs. They were never told that the same chemistry existed freely along riverbanks and roadsides. The absence of that information shaped expectations. Gardening became something you bought into, not something you participated in. Today, the disappearance feels complete. Gardening books rarely mention plant-derived rooting or fertility methods unless framed as novelty or folklore. The idea that a tree could replace a bottle sounds implausible to modern ears, not because it is false, but because it contradicts decades of conditioning. We have been taught to trust labels more than leaves, but history leaves traces. Old journals still exist. Research papers still sit in archives. The chemistry has not changed. Only our attention has. This story is not about conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No one had to ban a method for it to vanish. All that was required was a system that could not profit from free knowledge. Over time, what could not be sold stopped being taught. What stopped being taught stopped being remembered. And yet, the plants never forgot. The disappearance of this method was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. There were no public bans, no announcements, no declarations that the practice was wrong or dangerous. Instead, it faded quietly, page by page, edition by edition. Early gardening manuals mentioned it casually, almost in passing, as common knowledge. Later editions softened the language, calling it old-fashioned or unreliable. Eventually, it vanished entirely, replaced by footnotes about modern efficiency and laboratory precision. When knowledge is removed slowly enough, people stop noticing its absence. What remains feels complete, even when something essential is missing. This pattern has repeated throughout horticultural history. Techniques that could not be standardized, patented, or scaled for profit were labeled anecdotal and quietly excluded from formal education. Universities shifted toward chemistry-based solutions because they were measurable, repeatable, and fundable. Extension programs followed. Gardeners were not lied to directly. They were simply guided toward methods that required purchasing inputs rather than observing plants. Over time, the original practice became invisible, not disproven. The method did not fail science. Science moved on without it. What makes this disappearance especially striking is that the plants themselves never changed. Willows continued producing the same compounds. Cuttings continued responding the same way. Rivers still lined themselves with living repositories of the very hormones sold in bottles decades later. The knowledge was lost only on paper, not in nature, and that may be the most important lesson of all. Plants do not forget what they are capable of. They wait, quietly, patiently, until someone notices again. This is not a call to reject modern horticulture or dismiss scientific advancement. It is a reminder that progress does not always mean replacement. Sometimes it means recovery. Sometimes it means looking backward with better understanding than those who first observed these methods had. The past was not ignorant, it was observant, and many of its quiet techniques remain perfectly suited to the gardens we grow today. What makes this story linger is not just that the method works, but that it was never truly lost. It was simply set aside, quietly, gradually, not erased in a single moment, but faded through repetition, omission, and convenience. Gardening books did not suddenly declare it false. They just stopped mentioning it. Over time, silence did what argument never could. A technique that once passed freely from gardener to gardener became something people assumed had been replaced, improved upon, or made obsolete by progress. But plants do not recognize progress. They respond only to biology. When you step back and look at the long arc of horticultural history, this pattern repeats again and again. Methods that require observation, patience, and local knowledge tend to vanish first. They are difficult to package. They do not scale cleanly. They cannot be standardized across climates, soil types, and consumer expectations. Instead, they rely on adaptation, on noticing what grows nearby, on understanding why certain plants behave the way they do rather than forcing them to behave differently. Those kinds of skills do not disappear because they fail. They disappear because they demand something modern systems try to minimize: attention. What makes this natural plant method so remarkable is that it never depended on belief. It was never a theory. It was empirical. Gardeners used it because it worked, not because it fit a framework. Before laboratory isolation, before patents, before product lines, people recognized that certain plants carried properties that encouraged life around them. They did not know the molecular names, but they understood the results: cuttings rooted faster, survival rates improved, losses decreased. That knowledge was built through repetition, not explanation. When the explanation finally arrived centuries later, it did not invalidate the method, it confirmed it. And yet confirmation was not enough to preserve it. Once the active compounds were isolated, measured, and reproduced synthetically, the context shifted. What had once been a relationship between plants became a transaction between gardener and product. The same chemistry delivered through a different pathway altered how the knowledge was treated. It was no longer something you learned, it was something you bought. The method didn't disappear because it stopped being effective, it disappeared because it stopped being profitable. This is an uncomfortable realization, but an important one. It forces us to question how many other practices followed the same path. How many techniques quietly exited our collective memory, not because they failed, but because they didn't align with industrial systems. Gardening, like medicine, agriculture, and even education, underwent a transformation where efficiency and control took precedence over resilience and adaptability. What survived that transition were methods that could be standardized, branded, and sold repeatedly. What faded were methods that worked anywhere, anytime, with little dependency on supply chains. The natural method at the center of this story still exists because plants still exist. Rivers still carry willows along their banks. Seasonal growth still concentrates hormones in young tissue. Biological signals still behave the way they always have. Nothing about the plant changed. Only our relationship with it did. That is perhaps the most important lesson here. Progress did not replace this method. We simply stopped looking for it. There is a subtle shift that happens when you understand this. Gardening stops feeling like a sequence of steps you must follow correctly and starts feeling like a conversation you are participating in. Plants stop being passive objects and start revealing patterns. Why some cuttings root easily and others resist. Why certain environments encourage regeneration. Why damage does not always signal failure, but sometimes triggers growth. The natural method works not because it overrides plant behavior, but because it aligns with it. When people ask why they were never taught this, the answer is rarely malicious. Most instructors teach what they were taught. Most books reference other books. Over time, the absence becomes self-reinforcing. A method not cited appears irrelevant. A method not sold appears outdated. And a method not visible in mainstream practice begins to feel like folklore rather than fact. But folklore is often just science waiting for rediscovery. As you move forward, the choice is not between old and new. It is between passive consumption and active understanding. You can still use modern tools. You can still appreciate scientific explanation. But you can also recognize that some solutions were never meant to be proprietary. They were meant to be shared through observation and practice. When you rediscover one, you are not going backward. You are reconnecting. Gardening has always been a dialogue between humans and plants. For a time, that dialogue became one-sided. Instructions replaced listening. Products replaced experimentation. But the plants never stopped responding the way they always had. They were waiting, quietly, for someone to notice again. And now, more people are. If this method changes how you see the plants around you, then it has already done its work. Because the real power of forgotten knowledge is not in the technique itself, but in what it teaches you to look for next. The garden is full of answers we stopped asking questions about. And once you begin asking again, you realize how